The first thing I noticed was my cousin's name. It was printed directly beneath my father's on a copy of the deed. I read the page twice because I thought I had misunderstood it. Then I looked at my mother, and before I could ask a question, she said, "This doesn't change anything. We still need you to handle the roof." That sentence told me more than the document did. My parents had changed who legally benefited from the house. They had not changed who they expected to pay for it. For 8 years, that person had been me. My name is Rebecca Hale. I was 43 when this happened, and for most of my adult life, my family had described me with the same handful of words: responsible, practical, independent, the one who figures things out. Those words sounded flattering when I was younger. Eventually, I understood that in my family, they also meant available. If someone needed a ride, I was available. If a bill came at a bad time, I was available. If my parents needed help understanding insurance paperwork, calling a contractor, comparing quotes, or covering a shortfall, I was available. My younger cousin Natalie was described differently. She was sensitive. She was going through a lot. She had children. She needed support. Those descriptions followed us for years, and they shaped what everyone expected from each of us. I was the person who could carry more. Natalie was the person everyone was afraid to let fall. The house at the center of all of this was the one I grew up in. It was a 2-story brick house on a quiet street outside Columbus, with an uneven driveway, a maple tree in the front yard, and a kitchen my mother had wanted to remodel since I was in high school. My parents bought it when I was 6. By the time I was in my 30s, it needed almost everything. The roof was aging. The furnace was unreliable. The basement took on water during heavy rain. The back deck had soft boards. The windows leaked cold air every winter. My parents were not poor, but retirement had made their finances tighter than they admitted. My father had worked in commercial printing. My mother had worked part-time for a medical office. They had pensions, Social Security, and some savings, but they also had habits built during years when their income had been higher. They did not like saying, "We cannot afford this." They preferred saying, "We just need a little help this month." The first time I helped with the house, it really was an emergency. A pipe burst behind the laundry room wall in January. Water damaged the drywall and part of the floor. My parents' insurance covered some of it, but there was a deductible and extra work the policy did not cover. My father called me and sounded embarrassed. He said, "We're short about $2,700. I had the money. I sent it. There was no argument and no guilt. They thanked me. My mother cried. My father promised to pay me back, and I told him not to worry about it. That choice felt good. I was helping my parents stay comfortable in the home where they had raised me. A year later, the furnace failed. That cost more. Then came tree removal after a storm. Then a property tax increase they had not planned for. Then a leaking section of roof. Then a new water heater. Then a retaining wall issue near the back of the property. None of those expenses happened close enough together to look like a pattern while I was paying them. That was part of the problem. Each one arrived as its own isolated crisis. My father would call and say, "Bad timing." My mother would say, "We hate asking." And I would look at my savings, look at what they needed, and tell myself I could handle it. I had a stable career in hospital administration. I lived alone. I did not have children. I had no student loans by then. I drove a 7-year-old car and kept my expenses boring on purpose. That meant I usually could help. Over time, my parents stopped pretending they would pay me back. Instead, they started speaking about the house as though my contributions were part of a long-term arrangement. My mother would say, "You're protecting your future too." My father once said, "This house will stay in the family." None of this is wasted. Another time, when I hesitated over a plumbing estimate, my mother said, "You know this will all come back around to you eventually." She did not say, "We promise you the house." That distinction matters now. At the time, it did not feel important. There was only one child in the family they talked about inheriting anything, and that was me. I was their daughter. They were my parents. I did not ask for paperwork because I was not buying equity. I thought I was helping maintain a family home that would eventually become part of my parents' estate. That was enough for me. Natalie lived about 40 minutes away. She was my mother's sister's daughter, 6 years younger than I was. Her life had never been simple. Her marriage ended badly. She had 2 children. She changed jobs several times. For a while, she lived with her mother. Then her mother moved to Arizona, and Natalie rented a townhouse near my parents. My parents became very involved with her children. They picked them up from school. They paid for summer camps. My mother helped with groceries. My father covered a car repair. I did not resent any of that. Natalie needed help, and my parents liked feeling useful. The part that bothered me was what always happened when anyone noticed the difference. If my mother spent $3,000 helping Natalie move, she would say to me, "You understand. You're established." If my father paid for a semester of community college classes for Natalie, he would say, "You never needed this kind of help." They used my stability as a reason I should not care what happened. For years, I tried not to care. I told myself love was not an accounting system. Parents did not have to spend equal amounts on everyone. Families were messy. Needs were different. All of that is true, but there is a difference between unequal help and unequal respect. I did not understand that difference clearly until much later. The house expenses became more serious around the 5th year. My father's mobility declined after knee surgery, and he stopped doing basic maintenance himself. Suddenly, every problem required a contractor. A loose gutter became a service call. A broken stair rail became a carpentry bill. A patch of water damage became an inspection. I became the person who found the contractors, scheduled the appointments, compared the quotes, and often paid the invoice. My parents began saying, "Ask Rebecca," not just when they needed money, for everything. If a contractor wanted approval, ask Rebecca. If an insurance company needed documents, ask Rebecca. If the tax bill looked wrong, ask Rebecca. If the basement smelled damp, ask Rebecca. I became the invisible manager of a house I did not live in. And because I was good at it, no one noticed how strange that was. The year before I found the deed, I finally sat down and added up what I had spent. I did it because my financial planner asked why so much money was leaving my savings in irregular chunks. I opened old bank statements and made a list. The number surprised me. Over 8 years, I had spent a little more than $58,000 on my parents' house. That did not include gifts. It did not include dinners, vacations, or normal family expenses. That was just the property. Repairs, taxes, deductibles, maintenance, emergency work. I stared at the total for a while. Then I closed the spreadsheet. I did not send it to my parents. I did not ask for reimbursement. I only made one decision. From that point forward, I would not automatically say yes. I did not get the chance to test that boundary for long. 3 months later, my mother called about the roof. A contractor had inspected it after a windstorm and said they could probably stretch it another year, but replacement would be safer. The quote was just under $19,000. My mother said, "We thought maybe you could do half now and half after Christmas." I told her I needed time to think. There was a pause. Then she said, "Rebecca, this isn't really optional." I asked what she meant. She said, "The roof has to be done." I said, "I understand the roof has to be done. I'm saying I need to think about whether I'm paying for it." That was the first time I heard real irritation in her voice. She said, "Well, who else is going to?" I remember exactly how that felt. Not because she was angry, because the question was sincere. Who else is going to? My parents had stopped seeing my help as help. They saw it as the funding source attached to the house. A week later, I drove over to talk in person. My father had gathered several documents on the dining table: the roof estimate, their insurance policy, a home equity statement, and property tax papers. While he was in the kitchen, I started sorting them. That was when I saw the deed copy. I was not looking for it. It was simply mixed into the stack. My father's name was there, my mother's name was there, and beneath them was Natalie's. The document showed that Natalie had been added to the property 11 months earlier. I checked the date again. 11 months. During those 11 months, I had paid for a sewer line repair, a property tax shortage, tree trimming, and an insurance deductible after storm damage. No one had mentioned the deed. My mother came back into the room and saw what I was holding. She stopped walking. I asked, "Why is Natalie's name on this?" She glanced toward the kitchen. Then she said, "We were going to tell you." I asked when. She said, "It just never seemed like the right time." I looked at the roof estimate, then back at the deed. I said, "But asking me for $19,000 was the right time." That was when she said it. "This doesn't change anything. We still need you to handle the roof." For a few seconds, I said nothing. My father came back in and sat down. He looked uncomfortable, but not guilty. That difference mattered. People who feel guilty usually know they have crossed a line. My parents thought I was overreacting to a decision they believed made perfect sense. I asked them why they had added Natalie. My father said, "She needs security." I said, "And I don't?" He sighed. "Rebecca, you own your condo, you have retirement accounts, you have a good job. Natalie has 2 kids and no property." My mother added, "If something happens to us, we don't want her struggling." I said, "So you gave her part of the house." My father said, "We added her to the deed. We didn't give her the whole house." I asked what they expected to happen eventually. He said they had not decided everything. Then my mother said, "It's still a family home." I said, "For whom?" Neither of them answered. I asked whether Natalie knew. My mother said yes. I asked how long she had known. My father said, "Since we did it." That hurt more than I expected. Natalie had known for almost a year. My parents had known. I was the only person spending money on the house who did not know the ownership had changed. I asked one more question. "Did you think I would stop paying if you told me?" My mother immediately said, "That's not fair." I repeated the question. My father looked at the table. My mother said, "We thought you might take it personally." I said, "That isn't an answer." Then my father finally said, "We knew you wouldn't be happy." There it was. Not confusion, not forgetfulness, calculation. They had made a decision that benefited Natalie. They believed I might reduce my financial support if I knew, so they delayed telling me while continuing to accept my money. I wish I could say I shouted. I did not. I actually became very calm. Sometimes anger is loud. Sometimes anger makes everything unusually clear. I asked if Natalie had contributed anything toward the house during those 11 months. My father said no. I asked if she had offered. My mother said, "She has children, Rebecca." I said, "That wasn't my question." She told me Natalie had other responsibilities. I asked if I did not have responsibilities. My father said, "You know what we mean." I did know. They meant my life was organized enough to be available for theirs. Natalie's life was complicated enough to be protected from theirs. I put the deed back on the table. Then I said, "I'm not paying for the roof." My mother stared at me. My father leaned back in his chair. Neither of them seemed to believe I meant it. My mother said, "Don't be ridiculous." I said, "I'm not being ridiculous. Natalie owns part of the house now. You own the rest. The 3 of you can decide how to pay for the roof." My father said, "Natalie cannot afford that." I said, "Then maybe ownership is more expensive than everyone thought." My mother accused me of punishing Natalie. I said, "I'm not taking anything away from her. You gave her something. I'm simply not financing the thing you gave her." That was the first conversation. There were many more. For the next 2 weeks, my parents tried different versions of the same argument. First, they said I was emotional, then selfish, then petty, then obsessed with money. My mother said, "After everything we've done for you." My father said, "You're going to let this house deteriorate over paperwork?" I kept returning to one fact. The deed was not paperwork. It was ownership. They had made an ownership decision without me. That was their right. But they wanted their decision to have no effect on my obligations. That was the part I refused. Natalie called me 5 days after the dining room conversation. She sounded nervous. She said, "I heard you're upset." I said, "I'm not upset that you accepted the deed." That surprised her. I told her, "If Aunt Karen and Uncle Paul offered you part of a house, I understand why you said yes." She was quiet. Then I said, "What I'm upset about is that everyone expected me to keep paying for it without telling me." Natalie said, "I didn't know you were paying that much." I asked what she thought I paid. She said, "Your mom made it sound like you handled things here and there." I almost laughed. Here and there. I told her the number, a little over $58,000. She went silent. Then she said, "I had no idea." I believed her. That did not erase her responsibility, but it changed the shape of it. She told me my parents had approached her about the deed after she mentioned worrying about housing later in life. They said they wanted to make sure she and the kids would always have somewhere connected to family. She asked whether I knew. My mother told her, "Rebecca understands that you need this more." That sentence was carefully designed. It was not technically, "Rebecca agreed." It was close enough to make Natalie stop asking questions. I asked Natalie whether my parents had mentioned the roof. She said yes. They told her it would be replaced soon. She assumed they were paying for it. I said, "They were asking me to." Again, silence. Then she said, "I can't pay $9,000. I said, "I'm not asking you to pay me. I'm telling you the people who own the house need to decide what ownership means." She sounded frustrated. She said, "So what happens now?" I told her, "That's exactly the question I'm finally not answering." That was the boundary. Not revenge, not punishment, not making anyone suffer. I was done being the automatic solution. The roof did not collapse. The house did not become unlivable. The contractor had said they had some time. My parents hated that detail because it removed the emergency feeling they were used to creating. Without an immediate crisis, there was room for choices. My father looked into financing. My mother asked Natalie whether she could contribute monthly. Natalie called other contractors. For the first time, the three people who owned the house were actually discussing what the house cost. And something interesting happened. They did not like it. My father complained about interest rates. My mother said contractors were too expensive. Natalie said she could contribute maybe $300 a month, but not much more. They began looking at the property differently, not as a symbol, as an expense. That was how I had been looking at it for years. A week later, my mother called and said they had found a roofer who could patch the worst section for now. She asked if I would at least pay for the patch. It was $3,200. I said no. She said, "You can afford $3,200. I said, "That's not the point." She said, "Then what is the point?" I told her, "The point is that every time you say I can afford something, you act like that gives you the right to decide I should pay for it." She said, "Families help each other." I said, "Yes, help is chosen." She accused me of turning cold. I asked whether she thought changing the deed should have been discussed with me before they continued asking for money. She said, "It was our house." I said, "Exactly." That ended the conversation quickly. Because she was right. It was their house to manage. Their house to transfer, their house to repair, their house to finance. For 8 years, they had used family language to blur that distinction whenever they needed my money. Now I was simply respecting the ownership structure they had chosen. The pressure did not stay between the four of us. My mother called her sister, Natalie's mother, and within days I started getting messages from relatives who knew only the version where I had suddenly refused to help my aging parents. My aunt called first. She said, "Your mother is worried the house is going to become too much for them." I said, "It probably is." She sounded surprised by how easily I agreed. Then she said, "So why are you making this harder?" I asked what she had been told. She said my parents had done something nice for Natalie, and I had taken offense. I told her that was incomplete. Then I explained the timeline. The deed changed in September. In October, I paid the storm deductible. In December, I covered a tax shortfall. In February, I paid for tree work. In March, my parents asked me to replace the roof. My aunt was quiet. She asked, "They didn't tell you Natalie was on the deed before all that?" I said no. She said, "I thought you knew." That phrase followed me through the entire situation. I thought you knew. Natalie thought I knew. My aunt thought I knew. My parents were the only people who actually knew that I did not. That made the secrecy harder to dismiss as awkward timing. My mother had built a version of reality around me where everyone could assume I had agreed without anyone needing to hear me agree. A few days later, my father called and said I was making them look dishonest. I told him I was giving people dates. He said, "Dates can make anything look bad." I said, "Only if the order matters." He did not appreciate that, but the order did matter. If they had changed the deed and immediately told me, I would have been hurt, but I would have understood the new situation. If I had chosen to help after knowing, that would have been my choice. What I could not accept was being kept in the old arrangement financially while everyone else had already moved into the new arrangement legally. That distinction became more important when I went back through my records. I still had emails from my father asking me to approve contractor estimates. I had texts from my mother saying, "We're lucky you take care of this house." One message, sent 6 weeks after Natalie was added to the deed, said, "At least all this work protects what will someday stay in the family." I read that sentence several times. It was technically true. The house would stay in the family. They had simply allowed me to hear something more specific. I had filled in the blank myself. That was uncomfortable to admit. My parents had never signed a promise to leave me the house. They had used implication, and I had trusted it, so I made another rule for myself. I would not argue that I had been cheated out of an inheritance. That was not the cleanest truth. The cleanest truth was that they had allowed me to finance a property under one understanding while privately changing the arrangement that made that understanding reasonable to me. That was enough. I did not need to exaggerate it. I also stopped calculating whether my $58,000 was worth some theoretical share of the house. That road would have turned every Christmas, every repair, and every family conversation into accounting. I did not want reimbursement. I wanted the expectation to end. That was harder for my parents to understand than anger would have been. If I had demanded money back, they could have called me greedy. If I had demanded Natalie be removed, they could have called me jealous. Instead, I said the deed could stay exactly as they wanted it. I simply would not keep subsidizing it. There was no dramatic demand for them to fight, only a cost they could no longer route around themselves. And that was why the boundary held. A month later, my father asked me to come over. He had made another spreadsheet. That almost made me smile. He had calculated the cost of staying in the house for the next 10 years. Roof, furnace replacement, property taxes, insurance, possible foundation work, basic maintenance. The number was intimidating, he said. "We may have made this harder than we realized." I asked what he meant. He said adding Natalie to the deed had seemed like a way to give her security. But now they were realizing she could not help much with upkeep. I said nothing, he continued. "We thought you'd still be involved." There it was again. I asked, "Why?" He looked genuinely confused. "Because you always have been." I said, "That's history, not a contract." He stared at the spreadsheet. Then he said, "We thought the house mattered to you." I told him it did. That was part of why the betrayal hurt. The house mattered enough that I had spent 8 years protecting it. But if they had decided its future belonged partly to someone else, then my relationship to it had changed whether they liked that or not. My father said, "You were never guaranteed the house." I said, "I know." He looked surprised. I said, "You never owed me the house. But you also never told me you had changed the plan while continuing to let me finance the property. Those are separate things." That was the first time he did not argue. A few weeks after that, Natalie asked if we could meet for coffee. She brought a folder. Inside was a copy of the deed and several notes from conversations with my parents. She told me she was thinking about asking them to remove her name. I asked why. She said, "I thought they were giving me security." I didn't understand they were giving me responsibility they expected you to cover. That was more insight than I expected. I told her I was not asking her to give anything back. She said, "I know, but this is already making everyone angry at each other." I said, "The deed didn't make us angry. The secrecy did." She nodded. Then she said something I still remember. "Your mom keeps saying you changed." I asked, "Do you think I did?" Natalie thought about it. Then she said, I think you stopped doing what made everything easy. That was exactly right. My family had confused peace with my compliance. As long as I paid the bill, there was no conflict. As long as I solved the problem, everyone could believe the arrangement was fair. The moment I stopped absorbing the cost, the structure became visible. My parents eventually decided not to remove Natalie from the deed. Instead, they refinanced a small amount against the house to handle the roof and some other repairs. Natalie agreed to contribute a fixed monthly amount toward taxes and insurance. It was not much, but it was something. More importantly, it was clear. She knew what she was responsible for. My parents knew what they were responsible for, and for the first time in years, nobody automatically assigned the rest to me. I did continue helping my parents. That surprised some relatives. My mother had told people I was done with the family. I was not. When my father had a minor procedure, I drove him to the hospital. When my mother needed help understanding a Medicare notice, I sat with her and went through it. When their refrigerator died, I helped them research replacements. But I did not buy one. That difference felt enormous. I had not stopped loving them. I had stopped financing decisions I was not allowed to participate in. There were awkward moments. My mother would occasionally say things like, "The old Rebecca would have just handled this." I learned to answer calmly. The old Rebecca didn't know what she knows now. She hated that sentence. But she stopped arguing with it. About 6 months after the deed discovery, the family gathered for my father's birthday. Natalie was there with her children. My parents were quieter with me than they used to be, not hostile, careful. During dinner, my aunt asked how the house repairs were going. My father said the roof was done. My aunt looked at me and said, "I bet Rebecca handled all that." Before I could answer, Natalie said, "No, we did." Just 3 words, but they mattered. We did. Not Rebecca, not the responsible daughter, not the person who can afford it, the owners, the people attached to the decision. I looked at Natalie, and she gave me a small smile. That was probably the closest thing to an apology I ever needed from her. My parents never gave me one. Not directly. My father eventually admitted they should have told me sooner. My mother still believes I made too much of it. She says the house was theirs to do with as they wished. I agree with her. That is what made my decision simple. It was theirs. And once I accepted that fully, I also accepted that the costs did not belong to me unless I chose them. For years, I thought being dependable meant saying yes when I could. Now I think dependability also means being honest about where your responsibility ends. There is a particular kind of family role that develops around the person who is good at surviving. You become the backup plan. Then the backup plan becomes the first call. Then the first call becomes the assumption. And eventually, people stop asking whether you want to help. They only check whether you are capable of helping. That is not the same thing. Capability is not consent. Stability is not a blank check. And love is not an ownership interest someone else can assign. I do not regret the money I spent before I knew. My parents really did need help at times. The house really did need repairs. I made those decisions willingly. What I regret is how long I allowed everyone, including myself, to confuse generosity with duty. The deed forced me to see the difference. My parents had every right to put Natalie's name on their house. Natalie had every right to accept. And I had every right to stop paying for an asset whose future they had deliberately reassigned. No one had to be destroyed for that boundary to matter. No lawsuit was necessary. No public scene. No dramatic revenge. I only stopped making their decision financially invisible. Once I did, ownership became real. Responsibility became real. And the family finally had to live inside the arrangement they had created. If someone wants you to carry the cost of a decision, they should probably let you be part of making it.